Module 2, Chapter 3. Hi, Joe Cerrone. In this module, we're going to go through the draw commands from the textbook. Chapter 3 from our textbook covers draw commands. The learning objectives are to be able to understand the formats and types of coordinates, to be able to draw lines and circles using mouse input and drawing aids such as snap and grid, to be able to draw lines and circles using dynamic input, to be able to draw lines and circles using command line input, and to be able to use polar tracking with 3 coordinate entry methods. So as we look at AutoCAD and drawing, we have different types of objects. Objects being points, lines, arcs, and circles. And these would be simple objects that would be drawn with the draw commands. Other objects which are a little bit more complicated would be polygons, rectangles, ellipses, polylines, and splines. Let's take a look at those. We're going to launch our AutoCAD. As you can see, it has the recovery manager. This would be if I had like a power outage or something like that. And so I'm going to close that down here. And we're here at the main splash page. If I wanted to start a new drawing, I could say File, New, and just use the AutoCAD template, which would be our default template. And it basically just has nothing in it. It's just a grid and a snap. And I'm going to make this a little smaller. So as we look at the ribbon, we have these different draw commands here. And so for commands like arcs, we have a number of different ways that you can draw arcs. If you hit the down arrow, you can see that there's start, center, end, start, center, angle, start, center, length. There is a ton of ways to draw different arcs. But if we just draw an arc with a 3-point arc, I think we'll be fine. And so I'm going to hit the escape key. I'm going to set the layer properties here. I'm going to use a blue, and I'm going to set a line weight to 0.5 millimeters. By setting a color and a line weight, we can follow certain drafting standards. And we want our line weights to be enabled. And so if I were to draw an arc, just putting one out there, and then if I were to enable line weights, you'll notice that now it shows the line weight. Circles, again, a number of different ways to draw different circles. Center radius, we can go ahead and draw that circle. If I want a 1-inch radius, I can just type in 1. If I click on that circle and I hover over one of the grips, it will give me that radial measurement. If I wanted to draw a line, I can just click and draw a line. Notice that with polar tracking on, we will get these green lines that are called tracking lines. And so that green line right there is a tracking line, and then as I move it 15 degrees, I get another track. And what that allows us to do is to put in our coordinates with direct distance. And so I could type in 3, enter, while I'm tracking, while I have that green line, and then it will create that line at that angle and at that distance. We can turn off the grid just by clicking on the icon down here at the bottom, or you could type in the word grid and then hit the down arrow, turn it on. This is what's known as dynamic input. And so since dynamic input is on, the commands follow the cursor. In other words, wherever the cursor is, like where the cursor is right now, where it says specify first point, that's what's known as direct, as dynamic input. And so you pretty much want all of these objects checked off as far as working with CAD. Some of the other commands that we can look at here are polygon. And so here's polygon. We can say I want 5 sides. And then we can specify the center. And then it'll either be to the inside or to the outside of a circle. If it's inside, that means the radius would be on the inside. And so for example, if I repeat that command by right-clicking, and then I were to say 5 sides, if I want it to be right in the center, I have O snap on, and it's finding the center. And then if I go circumscribed, it will then go around the outside of that circle. Versus inscribed, would be to the inside of the circle. Polylines are lines that have multiple segments, but they're treated as one object. And splines are similar to that as well. If we were to look at a spline, and then it'll allow us to move that with these different grips and control points. All right, continuing. So as we look at these different commands, you'll notice that commands that have a little triangle underneath them will have the options for that command. And so there's a number of different ways to draw circles, number of different ways to draw lines, number of different ways to draw arcs. And so as we go through with these different coordinate systems, essentially we're using coordinate entry method where you have the X component and then the Y component. Mouse input is just clicking with the mouse on the screen. If you have the screen set up where you can come in here and you can select these different items, I can hit erase. If I go and I turn on my menu bar by hitting this little arrow next to the paper airplane, show menu bar, tools, drafting settings, allows us to go through and set up our snap and our grid if we want our snap and grid to be on at a 1/2 inch. Polar tracking is enabled. And I'm going to turn object snap off for right now and say OK. Now when I draw something, it will be on the grid. And so as you can see, I'm tracking from one square to the next. Right mouse click, enter, or escape. So command line input is the old school way of doing things, and I kind of like it because with command line input, you can type in the commands. And so I can type in C for circle, and it'll find all the commands that begin with C. And then I can go and access the circle command. If I use the command line input, here I have those other options of drawing circles. So if I wanted a 3-point circle, 1, 2, and 3 would be my 3rd point. So we can use the mouse to draw lines and circles. If we have grid and snap on, then they'll be aligned to the grid and they'll be more accurate, or they'll be easier to work with. It's like working on graph paper rather than having a number that's 2.4465. When we have the snap on and we draw a circle, we'll get a nice even number. And then they're showing different ways to draw a horizontal line here. Command would be line, pick point 1, comma 1, pick location 3, comma 1, press enter. And so this would be absolute coordinates. And so if I were to input with absolute coordinates, then you're basically putting in those numbers by saying line, and then the first point would be 1, comma 1, enter. And then if it's off the screen, I'm just going to move the cursor a little bit, panning and zooming. And then the next point would be 3, comma 1, enter. And then if I hit escape, you can see that these are the coordinates for that. And if I were to go to properties ID point, and I were to identify the endpoint here, you'd see it's 1, comma 1. And this one here is 4, comma 2. So as we go through and we work with these, and I thought that was supposed to be 3, comma 2, but I guess it was 3, units in length and 2 over. We'll come back to that as we get working with it. So location 3, 1 would be 3 units over and 1 unit up. 1, 1 would be 1 unit over and 1 unit up. And since the grid is at 1/2 inch, it would be 2 grid marks. Some of the other ways to draw lines would be with relative polar coordinates. And so relative polar coordinates would be how I would work with the next components. And so let me see where they have that here. Here it is. And so as we start to work with these other components, this would be another unit that we would use. A lot of these you really don't use so much. So this one here where we would say at 2, and then we would have an angle of 45, we could say line from a position, and we could say at 2 less than symbol 45. And what that'll do is draw a line 2 inches long at a 45-degree angle. And so the relative polar coordinates we'll use also. Direct distance, as we looked at it, this is our direct distance right here. When this is on, if I go to the settings for it, I have it set up in 15-degree increments. If I turn off the grid and I say OK, you'll see that we will track a line. There's one. There's another track. There's another track. And then as we're tracking, if I typed in 3, then it will give me a 3-inch line at that angle. And so it's kind of a shortcut compared to how we used to have to use the relative polar settings like at 3, angle 45. So it talks a little bit more about polar tracking and then setting up those different angles with what's called direct distance. And so you can see it has all these track lines, and once you have one of those green tracks, you can just type in the distance rather than to have to put in the at symbol, and it's just quicker. And then as we look at these different types of snap, we're just going to use regular grid and snap. We're not going to use these relative snapping increments, as they're kind of complicated and they're not used very often. Drawing lines using polar tracking, and so here's an exercise where they draw this desk set, and they opened up the AutoCAD DWT, and then they drew this with those different dimensions. Now this is not in architectural units, it's just using decimal units. And so if I were to erase this, and then with tracking on, you don't even need grid and snap. As long as tracking is on, you can click the start point, track to the right. I could say 2, enter. And then if I track north, I can type in 2, enter. You don't have to type 2.0000. And this one would be at a 45-degree angle. And I would type in, once I'm tracking, 1.4142, enter. And then I can track over to the right, type in 2. And so it's really quick as you start to work with the CAD system. And you start working with polar tracking. And so that's a quick example of using polar tracking to input coordinates. Other things that they go through and they show using AutoCAD is just some basic line construction, more shapes that they're just creating. Here's our drafting settings. Again, I don't use the polar tracking so much. I'll just use grid and snap, and those are located under Tools, Drafting Settings, Snap and Grid. And so we have a snap on, and if I turn on the grid, then you'll see it. You can also hit the F9 key or the F7 key. And then there's some chapter exercises to create these different geometries. And so we can create things like rectangles, triangles. And for a triangle, I would just create 3 lines. circle, rectangle, and squares. Alrighty. That completes the lecture for Chapter 3.